Getting into our morning keynote speaker is Dr. Amy Bucher, professionally. She's a vice president of behavior change design at MadPow. Her research interests include motivational design, patient and user engagement happiness, how social relationships influence health and well-being, ethical approaches to research and design, and across cultural behavior change strategies. Prior to joining MadPow, Amy worked at CVS Health as a senior strategic strategist for her digital specialist pharmacy, and at Johnson & Johnson's Health and Wellness Solutions Group, an associate director in behavior science. Amy received her AB, magna cum laude, in psychology from Harvard University, and her MA and PhD in organizational psychology from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Amy is the author of Rosenfield's media book, Engage, which you guys just learned about, that you're going to be, someone great is going to be receiving, Designing for Behavioral Change. Amy's talk today is Set and Achieve Your Product Vision with Behavioral Change Design. And with that said, Dr. Bucher.
Thank you so much. This is so cool. This is the first time that I have had my book being given away, and it's really exciting to see that. Makes me feel very legit. So I'm really glad to be here and excited to talk about behavior change design today. So let me just share my slides, and we can get started. All right. So I work in this relatively new, kind of unusual and interesting area of UX called behavior change design. And I think it's a really exciting place to work, but it's also, as I said, new and still unfamiliar to a lot of people. So one of the reasons I actually wrote a book was over the years, as I've grown my own career and brought together behavior change, which is my academic training, with the design work that I do in my professional life, I would have people reach out to me and ask, how do you get into doing what you do? What is behavior change design, and how does somebody become a behavior change designer? And there are a lot of really great resources out there about applying psychology to design work, but I really couldn't find one resource that talked about behavior change design the way that I practice it, which really is with a heavy focus on motivation, happiness, authenticity, and goals. And so at some point I thought, maybe I should write this thing. And over the last few years, that's what I worked on with Rosenfeld Media, and that's what Engaged is. But today I specifically want to talk about behavior change design as a way to think about creating your product vision and then developing the roadmap that will help you to achieve it. So I think of vision as a destination. It's the goal that you have for what your product could and should be. And in my mind, a vision is something that's far-reaching. It's not necessarily what you want in your version 1.0 or an incremental update from today's product. This is really your big, hairy, audacious goal that is somewhere out in the future. And you can think of that there's no product roadmap. I really like this metaphor of a map and directions to think about both product vision generally, but behavior change design specifically. So in the beginning, you may not have very much of an idea of what your product is beyond an initial spark or inspiration. You might have a sense that there's a problem and a solution that you're uniquely equipped to create. But what exactly that looks like, maybe not yet there. That's the spark of a vision, and it's a really important thing to capture and concentrate on. Once you figure out what that vision might be, that's where you can actually put the pin on the map and say, this is the destination that we're heading to. This requires a lot of work, as most of you know. If you've ever worked in an organization where you're really creating something net new or really transforming something that exists in the current market. So this is where you may be spending a lot of time doing a market scan, talking to users or potential users, really understanding the problem space and starting to hone in on what is the destination that we'd like to arrive at. And this by itself kind of is the vision, but it's not enough, as we know. It's not enough to just know where you want to go. You also have to know where you are. So one of the things I'll talk briefly about today as part of behavior change design is really understanding current state. Behavior change design is very metrics focused. And so part of the thing that makes a metric meaningful is to know what the change is. It's not just knowing, hey, our product did XYZ. It did XYZ, and it's different from what the world would have been like without it. So really understanding current state is important, and it's an anchor again for your map. And then once you have that, you can begin to plot your journey. So one of the things that is really cool about behavior change design is it helps you create directions that are accurate, efficient, and flexible. So if you run into this roadblock, you'll be able to recalibrate, turn around, and find a new way to reach your destination. So behavior change design, I posit, is a way to set the vision and plot the course. So it's telling you where you're going, and then it's like the map quest to get there. All right, so what is this thing? Behavior change design is a process, and the way that we practice it at MadPow is what I'm sharing right now. It's a 4-step process, and I will say, behavior change design is a new field, and in the last few years, I'd say the last 5 years, I have noticed there's more of a community of behavior change designers, sort of these separate schools of people who have been doing the work and now are starting to coalesce into more of a unified community. And one of the things I've noticed that is really cool is that we're all using similar processes, although the number of steps that you might see or the labels that are on the steps might look different. I used to describe this as being like the scientific method applied to design. But the 4 steps, and I will go through these in detail, are first of all, diagnosis, which is really understanding the problem state and understanding the people who are experiencing whatever that problem state is. Prescription or prescribe is where we start to think about solutions and basically develop our requirements, put together that roadmap to achieve the vision. Implement is when we build the thing, whatever that is. It could be a digital product, it could be an experience. Oftentimes it's really a blend of the two because products are embedded within a larger experience. And then there's evaluate, which is seeing how effective the product is out in the world. And I have the arrows here because although evaluate is the 4th step, we all know from being UX professionals that research is really embedded every step of the way. And in fact, the more often that we can be doing research, whether it's looking at past projects and seeing what worked well and what can be improved, or just talking to users, we know that embedding that throughout the entire process is a really important key to success. And I would say it's also particularly important for that flexibility bit that I mentioned, being able to recalibrate if there's something that doesn't go according to plan. So we list it out at the end because with behavior change design, we do have a tendency to look at kind of, capital O outcomes. We often will plan outcome studies, and you may see that there are peer-reviewed papers that sometimes come out of behavior change projects where, we're kind of trying to contribute to the scientific literature. But evaluation really does form a thread that goes through the whole process. I think of behavior change design as a different lens on UX. So I work in an organization where I collaborate closely with all different types of user experience professionals. So researchers and experience strategists and visual designers and interaction designers. And honestly, oftentimes the tasks that we work on are very similar. So we have a lot of the same tools in our toolkits. The difference between my work and theirs is that I'm often considering the things that I do through a lens of behavior change science, specifically psychology. I'll share a few of the frameworks that I use to do that to give you a little bit more color. But I do want to emphasize that behavior change design fits really well within a lot of our existing organizational structures and UX teams because we do have that common toolkit and a lot of common goals and approaches. So for me, it's really been a joy to work with other sorts of UX professionals, learn about the tools that they're able to use and what they're able to achieve with them, and then bring my own background in psychology and behavior change to that. So how is behavior change design unique though? Because as I was going through this, I was thinking, just using a framework maybe isn't enough to distinguish it, but it certainly is something that is a standalone field. So one thing, and I will talk more about this, is that a behavior change design project always focuses on target behaviors. So one of the very first things that I do with every project that I touch is I ask, what are we trying to get people to do? And we get really, really specific about those target behaviors, and they form the focal point of our design decisions from there on out. The second one is this use of psychological theories and frameworks. So I will, again, share a couple of my favorite ones that I use frequently in my projects, but Typically what I'll do is, this will guide the research questions I ask. It will guide the solution set that I am considering for the project. And it will really help me to focus in again on those target behaviors and the ways that I'd like to help people change them. We also think about affect, cognition, and motivation as drivers of behavior. When I was in school, like early days studying psychology, they would often talk about the ABCs of psychology. So affect, behavior, cognition. I'm reordering it a little bit here, but affect being the emotional experience that people have. And we know that the way people feel has a lot to do with what people do. Cognition being the things that they think about, their belief systems, their perceptions of the world. And then motivation I like the description of it as desire with velocity. So it's taking a target, like a target behavior. There's something you want to do, and then there's a level and a source of desire to do that. And so we really spend a lot of time thinking about those things as really central to the design process. And then lastly, as I mentioned, this measurement and monitoring of behavioral outcomes. Of course, research is deeply embedded in the fabric of UX practice generally. With behavior change design, there's a particular focus on doing this as kind of an endpoint and really formalizing the success metrics around a particular project. So I think these are 4 ways in which behavior change design does look a little bit different from other UX disciplines. So behavior change designers, this is my kind of dictionary definition of it, but there's a few important things in here. So we facilitate the ability of people to work toward goals by designing interventions that address barriers to target behaviors and promote conditions that are favorable to target behaviors. I already talked a little bit about target behaviors and how those are really important. 2 other things I want to highlight: goals. So I mentioned I work from a place of motivational science. And one of the lessons that's really core to that is that goals are owned by the user, not by the designer. So a big part of my job as a behavior change designer is to talk to users and understand what it is they want to achieve, really understand their goals in their words, and then help to design something that facilitates that supports them in what they're hoping to do. And oftentimes that also means echoing the language that they use when they talk about what they want to achieve. So that conversation with the user up front, I can't overemphasize how important it is to the work that I do. And a really fun and sometimes challenging part of my job is negotiating that overlap or non-overlap between what the user goals are and what the business goals are. And I say overlap because most times there is quite a bit of overlap. So I work a lot in health, and I might work on something that, like, let's say it's for people with diabetes, and the goal is to get their A1C below 7. So, this is a health metric that indicates that their diabetes would be well controlled or not. That's the business goal, the clinical goal. That's not the user goal. They also want their diabetes to be well controlled. But if you talk to somebody with diabetes about what they are hoping to achieve through all the health management stuff that they have to do, they're not going to say, I want my A1C below 7. They're going to say, I want to be able to enjoy my life. I want to be able to go watch my kid play softball and not worry about feeling like I'm going to pass out. It's these real life sorts of ways that they think about their goals. And so understanding that and being able to talk about the overlap between the 2 sets is core to my job and one of my favorite pieces of it. And then the next piece here is this idea of interventions. So interventions are basically anything that behavior change designers build. It's a kind of a jargony term that just means the product in my world. And interventions, they can be products, so a digital thing or a piece of written communication, a marketing tool. They can also be experiences. So I work with experienced strategists, as I mentioned, and a lot of the work that I do is really thinking about that overall experience and how do we make sure that the multiple touch points that are part of that experience are all supporting the same message, the same set of target behaviors. And the key thing here, again, is that there's a behavior involved. So an intervention is not just a product. It's a product that is trying to help people do something differently than they would have if they hadn't encountered it. Just to put a little bit more color around it, these are some examples of interventions. They're all digital because digital is easier to show. So please know as I talk that not every intervention is digital, but if you're trying to show a visual of something, digital lends itself really well to that. So Nagbot is an app that people can download, and there really isn't a lot of context to it. You say what your goal is and you tell it how often to nag you about it. So it's something that people can kind of self-service to support their work toward a goal. Wobot is really cool. It's a chatbot that is designed to help people improve their mood. So I would recommend checking it out. I think it's one of the better conversational chatbots that are out there. And it's based on a cognitive behavioral therapy foundation. So it's really got behavior science woven right into its fabric. Headspace is really familiar to a lot of people. So it's a meditation and stress management app. And again, it's aiming to help people manage those emotions differently. And then lastly, in the investment space is Stash, which is an investment app for people who are new to investing, maybe don't really understand what investing is. And it guides them through a process to put their money in accounts differently than they would have otherwise. I like to offer these examples because I find sometimes people aren't clear on what an intervention is. And actually, when I was writing my book, one of the first things I did, I had this vision that I would run surveys and get feedback from people about what they thought behavior change was and what are their favorite behavior change design things and apps and tools. And I started by asking on Twitter and on LinkedIn for people to give me examples of some of their favorite interventions. And I was really surprised to find that most of what people suggested were not actually interventions. So people would talk about things like Facebook or Spotify, which really, if you just think about the product, those are content delivery platforms. In and of themselves, they're not aiming to change behavior. They are excellent tools that you might use in a behavior change design project, but in and of themselves, they're not interventions. So it was kind of a realization for me that when I use this term intervention and I toss it around, it doesn't really mean something to everybody. So I decided it was worth my time to actually explain what I mean by intervention. And these are some examples of what I mean. So research is a really core part of behavior change design. And that's one of the reasons why many of my favorite colleagues are UX researchers. Our toolkit is deep. We do all the stuff. So, I mentioned our toolkits tend to overlap quite a bit. There's a few things here that I think are less familiar to folks in other UX disciplines, but a lot of these are going to feel really comfortable for you. One that is a little different is the literature review. So most of the projects that I work on early on in the project, once we understand what the problem space is, and maybe we also understand what behavior change framework or theory that we're going to use to frame up the problem. But we would actually go into research databases and look at papers of previous work and see, what in the past has been effective to change people's behavior in this domain, so that we can borrow what's successful and avoid what isn't, or adjust it. Because oftentimes something that's not successful, it's not that it was bad, it's that maybe it was the wrong time, the wrong place, or a detail needed to be updated. So the lit review is one research tool that I think is a little bit different. But beyond that, we do, stakeholder and user interviews. We do observations, contextual inquiries, where we might embed ourselves in a context and watch people perform their behaviors in that context. Operational analysis is really big with service design. So understanding all the folks who keep a business running and their role in the user experience. At MadPow, we do quite a bit of participatory design where we invite people to create things as part of our research process so that we can actually involve them in solutioning. We do usefulness and desirability testing when we have early prototypes, see if it's meeting the mark or not. Surveys and A/B tests. User feedback is a really key one. So once a product's out in the world, actually monitoring what people think of it. And that can be a really useful way to identify quick fixes and ways to make something more effective. And then these three at the end here are the ones where it starts to get, again, a little bit more unique. Real world observations. The version of this that you would see outside of behavior change is the case study, but with behavior change, we sometimes will actually do more robust, kind of proactive, prospective, real-world observations where we intend in advance to collect this data so that we can build out the case study, build out the research case. And then there's quasi-experiments and randomized control trials, which are both much more robust ways of measuring whether or not your product has made a difference compared to, typically it's not compared to nothing, it's compared to something that is, state of the art. So when I worked on a project with improving sleep, for example, in our randomized control trial, we compared people who used our intervention to people who did a sleep diary, which is considered state of the art. Like that's generally, if you go to a doctor with a sleep problem, they're going to ask you to keep a sleep diary as a first step. So we compared our tool to that and found that it was more effective. So we do a ton of research. And one of the things that you'll notice as I continue to step through our process is that I have a lot of things to say about diagnosis and prescription, those first two steps. and then a lot less to say later on, because to go back to my map metaphor, part of how behavior change design helps you set and achieve that vision is by creating the map. Creating the map is a lot of work. And once you have the map, you can kind of follow it. Like, that's a little bit less effortful. We're front loading the effort in the project so that, later on, hopefully it's fairly straightforward to march toward that vision. So during the diagnosis phase, we're really defining where we are and where we want to go. We're doing the 2 pinpoints on the map, the destination pinpoint and the current location pinpoint. This is a tool that is really central to my work, and I essentially have an entire chapter about it in the book because it is so crucial to do, and to do this early. So this is an outcomes plan, and it's something that I, as a consultant, I work closely with my clients on putting together. So this goes left to right. This is following time, where baseline measurements are today and long-term outcomes are your vision for the future. But when we're building this, we actually do it backwards. So we start by talking about the long-term outcomes. Where do we hope to go? And after we build those out, we say, okay, in order to get there, what are the behaviors that our users need to do differently? What are those target behaviors? In order for them to do those target behaviors differently, how do they need to interact with the intervention? What do we need to deliver to them in terms of change and change support to get those behaviors to change? And then what is going on now? What is going on today that establishes that baseline where the change will be coming from? So we're going to populate this entire thing, but we're really going to start with the long-term outcomes first. Oops, wrong button. So a key risk in any product visioning exercise, I think, is that success metrics are unclear, and behavior change design specifically solves for this by defining those target behaviors and outcomes targets as a first step. This is where you get that clarity of vision, and it makes it unambiguous later on when you're looking at your product to say, did we meet the mark or not? And perhaps more importantly, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, if we didn't meet the mark, what can we adjust so that we do? So in terms of building an outcomes plan, I mentioned we're really starting with understanding the long-term outcomes first. And so this is an example if you were building an intervention to help people manage high blood pressure. And again, these right here are framed in terms of those business or clinical objectives, because this is work that we're doing behind the scenes as designers, with our clients. And so here, what we want to see, or what my clients would want to see if they were doing this sort of product, is they'd want to see changes in biometric markers. They'd want to see people are actually getting healthier. So that's what this, reduction in blood pressure, cholesterol, weight. They would want to save money. Like pro tip, clients always have something in this long-term outcomes bucket about saving money, return on investment, something like that. And if they're not bringing it up, it's worth probing on, because that is always, always, always part of the equation. So cost savings from less emergency room use is a really common one that I see in the health area. And then fewer heart attacks and strokes. Theoretically, if people are controlling all of these other factors, we should see that manifest in fewer acute health events. And then we think about, how do we actually get this data? So we can measure this through electronic medical record data. If someone is actually seeing their physician, that this data might exist in their electronic medical record, or health claims if they're using their insurance plan. And then comparing that to what the baseline measurements are. So the defining target behaviors I mentioned is a really, really key part of behavior change design. And I like the chicken and egg thing because, it's what comes first. Is it the target behavior, the outcome you're trying to achieve? And in the process, typically from a practical perspective, you're really focusing on the outcome first, but the behavior is the key thing, because that's how you arrive at the outcome. So when I do this as a workshop, I will actually ask people to go through and rate which ones are behaviors. I'm not going to have you do that now with the virtual format, but this tends to trip people up a little bit, because these are all kind of worthy design targets, or most of them are, but they're not all behaviors. So the ones that are behaviors, you'll notice they're really concrete and measurable. It's for the most part something you could probably see somebody do. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why observation is such a core part of our toolkit, our research toolkit. People often aren't even great at self-reporting what their behaviors are, but if we can combine talking to them with watching them, we can understand what they're actually doing. So things like walking in the park, or reading a chapter a night, or practicing Spanish vocabulary, those are all behaviors. And when we're working on defining them for a project, we actually want to get as specific and as crisp as possible in describing what these behaviors are. The ones that aren't are the things like feeling confident or losing weight, which is an outcome but not a behavior in and of itself. You have to do behaviors to get there. And then preparing for retirement, I put in a different color just because the way that it's phrased there is not a behavior, but it can easily be broken down to behaviors. So, things like creating a plan and a budget or, designating money to go into a savings account. Those are behaviors that might fall into that. So if I'm working with someone and they suggest something like that as a target behavior, my question back to them is like, okay, let's break that down. What does that mean? What does that look like? So which behavior should we target, though, is the thing, because as you might guess, there are usually a lot of candidate target behaviors, and any product can only do so much. And in fact, that's one of the challenges of setting a vision and marching toward it, is being specific about what things belong in the vision and what things do not. So it's really difficult. No product is all things to all people. So it's part of the discipline is defining what you aren't as well as what you are. And part of that comes from picking what your target behaviors are. So the way that we tend to do this, this is actually often a really fun thing to do early in a project. Get in a room with your team virtually and brainstorm, knowing what our outcomes are, knowing what we're trying to achieve. What are all the different things that people could do differently that would help make that happen? And in the spirit of brainstorming, don't constrain the thinking here. Generate that long list. But once you have it, scale it back with, again, some discipline. So some of the questions that we will ask when we're trying to figure out what is that tight core set of target behaviors that we're going to design toward is, first of all, which ones are most related to the big outcome goals? And this is where that literature review tool can help a lot as well, because we can look and see that in previous work in this domain, I'll give an example, weight loss and weight maintenance. There is now quite a bit of research that shows that one of the key behaviors that predicts whether or not people who have lost weight can keep it off is if they weigh themselves every day. So people who weigh themselves frequently, who really monitor that, are more successful at keeping weight off. So if we were designing something where maintaining a weight loss was really important, we'd want to focus in on that weighing yourself frequently behavior, because research suggests it's really important. So that's the first question. And then some of these questions are really practical, right? We are not working in a fantasy world. We have to think about timelines and budgets and client priorities. So do we actually have access to the people who do that behavior? Like, that weight maintenance thing might be really, really easy if everybody was receiving free healthy meals at home by drone every day, but we don't have access to like the people who would be making and delivering those meals. Those aren't our users. So we wouldn't consider something like that, even if it would be effective. Can we influence the people who do that behavior with our toolkit? So again, are they our user base or not? And then what is the effort and cost of influencing those behaviors relative to their effect? We will want to capture some of the low-hanging fruit things that maybe aren't going to make a huge difference in outcomes, but it's easy enough to do. And, it does contribute to the bottom line. So why not do them? And there may be things where in an ideal world, this is what we would do, but it's so expensive or so effortful, or the technology is out of our reach. So it's not a thing for today. And so what you see at the bottom of the screen here is a sample evaluation grid. We would actually write out that list of potential target behaviors and then rate them, give them a score, and look at which ones have the highest score to include as candidates in our product. And the specific things that you rate them on can change depending on the parameters of your product, but I think it is important to go through a little bit of a disciplined exercise so that what you're choosing is really the things that are going to make a difference and not necessarily the things that are just most appealing to you, or maybe that you're used to working on, so you assume that they might be included. So once you've gone through that exercise, you can fill out the next piece of the outcomes plan here. So for our high blood pressure folks, we would want to make sure that they're making a doctor's appointment, that they're getting their prescriptions filled if they're prescribed something for, for their blood pressure, that they're taking that medication, and that they're walking. So, gentle exercise is a really important thing. And one of the side notes I'll make here about behavior change design research is that oftentimes the product is not able to capture these behavior changes directly. So if you think about something like an app, it won't necessarily know if a user went to the doctor unless the user tells us that. And so we'd want to make sure that we're building in mechanisms to measure those things. In this case, in this example, it's providing a survey every 3 months and asking people what they've been doing. But it's important to think about how will we actually know if these behavior changes are happening. And how much intervention do we need to deliver to change those behaviors? So not all behaviors require the same support. This is another thing about behavior change design. I wouldn't typically work on a project where the goal is to get more clicks on a website. The behavior science around that is fairly well known. It's very accessible to people who don't have a formal background in behavior science, and it's a pretty standard toolkit. There's some creativity involved in it, but for the most part, we understand how that happens, and it's not a particularly complex behavior. So that would kind of go at the bottom of the diagram here. But when you think about behaviors that are more sustained over time or that require more levers to change, that's where behavior change design really starts to have an impact. And so we think about things like managing a chronic health condition, where somebody maybe has comorbidities, they have multiple health conditions, they have to take medication, they have to change their diet, they have to exercise. That's where behavior change design's toolkit really comes in handy, because it can handle all of these complexities. And one that's come up recently with coronavirus, with COVID, is all the behavior change that we're looking at related to that. It's incredibly complex. So we're looking at shifting behaviors, not just at an individual level, but really at a societal level, around things like how we gather together for a conference, mask wearing, hand washing. And so it's a really tough behavior change problem to solve. So once we figure out, and again, this is going to be based on the literature, on our own research, how much we should expose people to our intervention and how we're going to measure that that has happened, we can complete this outcomes plan. So really here we're looking at, if it's a digital app, we want to make sure people are using it, they've registered for it, they're visiting it, they're reading the educational content, and they're logging actions. So they're telling us things like, I did make that doctor's appointment. So this is what the complete outcomes plan would look like. And then we're able to use this ongoing to understand whether or not we're successful. So when you look at this map, the longer term outcomes really are the vision. This is, what is this product going to be? What is it going to achieve? The user behavior over time is what gets us there. The product or intervention delivers the support, the magic ingredient that actually creates the behavior. And then the baseline measurements are how we see that the change is happening. So this tool, I think, is really at the heart of behavior change design, especially as it relates to product vision. A key risk with any product is that nobody actually wants or needs it. And I actually do see this quite a bit in my work, at least initially, where you'll get an executive or a team who's really excited about something, but you start to go out and do your user research and people are saying like, I don't want that. Like, I don't care. So an outcomes plan helps to address this upfront, to avoid this from happening by tying product features to the desired outcome. So making sure that what you're building is actually going to target what you're trying to do. And when you're talking to your users ahead of time, it really helps to crystallize, like, okay, if we were trying to get to this endpoint, like, what would you need to do differently? And what are you willing to do differently in order to get there? And as I mentioned, talking to users about their motivations and their goals helps to establish that product desirability and fit. So to go back to that example of, diabetes, and users are not looking to lower their A1C below 7. Well, if we go out there and we're marketing this diabetes app talking about A1C below 7, we've really missed the mark. And it's not necessarily the fault of the product. It's our fault for not talking about the product in a way that resonates with the user. So our behavior change design approach can help us to avoid that. So as we transition from diagnosis into prescription, this is where we're starting to lay down that roadmap. We know where we want to go. Let's really start to get specific about how. One of the things that's very important is examining that behavior in context. So I've mentioned this a few times. This is a model from Bronfenbrenner. So it's just the ecological model of human behavior. And the point it's trying to make is really simple. We live in a system. So when you're thinking about an individual behavior, you have to consider all of the circles in which they're embedded. And that's the people closest to them, like their family, their friends, their colleagues who they see every day. But then it's also, the larger community that they live in, the other institutions that influence their behavior. A really important piece is that, we're all part of a culture, or multiple cultures really, that create the mental models we have for how the world works. Our belief systems affect how we behave. And so understanding all of this context can help us be more effective as designers. And it helps us with this key risk here too, that the product doesn't fit people's lives. So that's another thing where people might agree, yeah, this is a really worthy goal. This is something I would like to have, but it just doesn't fit in with all the other things that I have to do, because I do live in this complex context and there are 400 things on my to-do list. And as much as I like this product that you're offering to me and think it sounds like a good idea, it's just not winning real estate at the top of the to-do list. So again, not only talking to people about their goals and their beliefs and their experiences, but also testing these products against real world scenarios. So trying to understand, if this was available to you, how does it actually fit into your daily life? And what might you need to do differently? Is there something that has to drop off that to-do list? And how do we make a strong enough case where you're willing to do that? So I keep mentioning behavior change theories and frameworks. Let's get into it a little bit here. This is a non-comprehensive list of some of the behavior change theories and frameworks that a behavior change designer might use. Some of these will probably be familiar to people. Behavioral economics is really popular right now. So this idea of nudges and designing things to subtly influence people's behavior. But some of these are more obscure, and you may only find them in a really specialized domain. When I'm beginning a project, I do not start with this list and knock through. As I said, I have a few favorites that tend to be my go-tos, my standbys, because I know that they tend to be appropriate for the types of problems that I work on. I'm very comfortable with the toolkit, and they yield the type of results that I'm looking for. So in terms of choosing a framework, is it applicable? Does it have a strong recent evidence base? Sometimes these theories and frameworks fall out of popularity. Sometimes it's because the evidence for them isn't that strong. Sometimes it's just because a new vanguard of researchers comes up and they're excited about something different, and so the old theory doesn't get as much attention. But in any case, we want to see that there's a recent evidence base if we're going to use a framework for a project. And then if we use it, will it actually be useful? Because that's the other thing. Some of these frameworks are very intellectually interesting, but they don't tell you what you should do with your design. And as a behavior change designer, I'm not just interested in what's theoretical. I'm interested in what I can put into a product so that it actually helps people do something differently. Once we have the framework, what do we do with it? Well, first of all, we shape our research questions or our approach to include key concepts from the framework. So I will share an example of a framework that really helps do just that. A lot of these frameworks come with validated question sets. So questionnaires that research has established really do measure something. And why not borrow those? Why not use those questionnaires, right? We also would look to the framework for possible solution ideas based on what we find in the research. So these frameworks will tell us, if you perceive problem A, solution B is likely to work. Let's build off that. And then I think they can be great for generating creative thinking as well. So I use some of these frameworks as brainstorming tools. We essentially use them as lenses for brainstorming. Get in a room and think, okay, what are 10 ways that we can support somebody's feeling of relatedness in this product? So example, COM-B, this is the one that I mentioned that's really great for shaping research. This comes from University College of London. I have quite a lot of content on this in the book if you're interested in it. And also the UCL team has open sourced all of their research. So if you just search for behavior change wheel and COM-B, you'll find tons of great resources. But at its base, what this model says is that for any behavior to happen, we've defined the target behavior, people need to have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to perform it. And so when I'm approaching a project with COM-B, one of the first things that I'm doing, so first of all, I'm defining the behavior or behaviors that we're trying to influence, and typically it's behaviors plural. And then I'm going to ask questions of my users. What are your capability, your opportunity, and your motivation? And this is what it looks like. So tell me about what it's like for you to do this behavior. And there's some work that falls on me to parse through what they say. I'm not actually just directly asking them, like, what is your capability to do this behavior? I'm figuring it out based on their answer, but I'm trying to get them to tell me a story so that there is rich detail for me to parse through. What, if anything, makes it hard for you to do this behavior? What, if anything, makes it easier for you to do this behavior? And we can then even probe in further, capability, for example, what makes it physically challenging? I did one project on fire safety, where we found that for some people, it was actually really physically difficult to check the batteries in their smoke alarms, which is an important behavior for fire safety. So knowing that, we were able to suggest some interventions that basically involved getting them help to do that. Once we know what the barriers are based on the COM-B model, this is the back half of it. I mentioned frameworks can also help us find the right solution set. So this is essentially a decision tree. If we find a physical capability barrier here, we can look at the types of solutions. These are just categories. There's still design work to be done once you find them. But if someone has a physical capability issue, one of the things is enablement. And I just mentioned, getting people help with the smoke alarms. That's a great example of enablement. So this helps to narrow down the solution area based on the research that we've done. So a key risk in any product is choosing the wrong features, and a model like COM-B helps us to avoid that, because it helps us to ensure that each feature serves a purpose of overcoming a barrier that exists that prevents somebody from doing the target behavior. Being really specific about the barriers that people are experiencing helps us do this well in design. Second example, this is my bar none favorite behavior change design approach, self-determination theory. This is a theory of motivation. And it helps to get at that problem of getting users to rally behind your vision, getting them on board. So I chose an image here of the Pied Piper. If you're familiar with the fairy tale, it's playing the tune, and all of the rats in the village of Hamelin follow the Pied Piper. Understanding people's motivation and speaking to it is like playing that irresistible flute. So I'm not going to go through this in extreme detail, but what you need to know is that the type of motivation people have, the thing that is motivating them, matters a lot. And the more that they have a personal source of motivation, what's over here on the right, and this autonomous motivation, the more they're going to stick with a product and engage in the behavior change that the product is trying to promote. So again, early on in a project, I like to talk to my users, talk to the people who might be users of the product, and understand in their own words what it is they're trying to achieve. And I'm specifically looking for what are their goals, and not necessarily tied to the product, but tied to their life. How do they think of themselves? What are the things that they value? What is the type of identity they have? Do they think of themselves as sporty or independent? Because those are things that I can tie into the product. And what do they enjoy? What tends to be less successful over time is doing something like an external motivator. We're going to pay people to use the product. That may work for a little while, but we know from tons of research that it doesn't work long term. So as a behavior change designer, one of my key goals is digging in on what personally matters to people so that I can use that in my design. And once I do know that, I can build experiences that support it. And so these experiences do three things. They support autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So basically, I'm looking, can I give people meaningful choices? Can I help them feel like they're learning, growing, and succeeding? And so most UX folks accurately know right there that we're talking about feedback. How do we give people really meaningful feedback? What is the right delivery mechanism? What's the right delivery frequency? But how do we help them know that they're progressing? And then relatedness is about feeling like you belong to something bigger than yourself. It's providing people with that sense of social connectedness. So I'm always looking for opportunities to do these three things as they relate to what's personally meaningful to people. And one of the reasons I love self-determination theory is that in the 40 or so years that it's existed, the research community has done a ton of work specifically looking at how these sorts of qualities show up in design. So there's a lot of evidence that you can work with, a lot of prior work that you can build off of. So the product isn't engaging, always a key risk. And hopefully my description of self-determination theory has shown how using that approach can really help with it, because we're deliberately looking for ways to support the things that engage people. Implementation is just about following the map you've plotted. And I don't want to just say, I will acknowledge that my design colleagues who are key in implementation, they're awesome, they're workhorses. I don't have the skill set to create a visual design to actually illustrate the screen or program the interaction. So my work tends to be light in this phase. I don't mean to imply that the work overall this is a ton of work. But for the behavior change designer like myself, this is really about following the map that we've plotted and working with my design colleagues to see that the things they're implementing are being done with fidelity. So there's still brainstorming and ideating. There's this translational piece. So we've decided that this is the approach we're taking. What does that look like? There's a lot of testing prototypes or early designs with users and internal stakeholders and making sure that we're meeting the mark. There's really figuring out and prioritizing what the best options are to include in the release. So sometimes we have, alternatives or decisions to make. We can only include X number of features. Which are they going to be? And as I said, really working with those other teams to make sure that the things that they're building accurately reflect what the behavior change behind it is intended to do. So I do just Panacea Digital is a great example. Marta Dinkowitz, who runs it, has built up all of these great mock screens that show different behavior change concepts and how they might actually look in an app. And so she's done an awesome job of basically creating a library that translates these sort of fuzzy conceptual things into something very concrete. And I find it really helpful in communicating what behavior change design could look like. So recommend you check out Panacea Digital. And then I mentioned evaluation. We do research throughout, but really at the end, we want to set ourselves up for the next journey. I like to say that evaluation is about telling a story. And I also like to say that because I find that for people who aren't quantitative, who aren't comfortable with numbers, this can feel like a really scary thing. But really, we're trying to tell a story. We want people to understand why our product is, why it matters, why it makes a difference. And so I mentioned some of these before, but at the end of a project, when we are trying to test whether our product actually works, effectiveness and efficacy. Effectiveness is like, does it work in the real world with all the messiness of context? And efficacy is a little bit cleaner, in a controlled environment compared to something like that state-of-the-art sleep diary. Is it making a difference? We might want to look at both. We might want to just look at effectiveness, the real world context, but either way, we want to see, does this thing work? And so we're going to be doing these sorts of activities and trying to create that story, that case for, is this product something that is making a difference? And I mentioned before that, getting stuck with a product that doesn't work is also a big risk. And sometimes people like it, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Behavior change design really helps because we measure things granularly. And so if something's not working, if we've done our job right, we can actually look at our data, look at our research, and figure out why it's not working. And I have a colleague who I interviewed in the book, Heather Cole-Lewis, and she has this metaphor that I love where we're able to not just throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can test the temperature of the water and see if maybe it's too hot or too cold. Did we use the wrong soap, et cetera, et cetera. So if we've done our measurement right, we can actually go back and make these more detailed decisions about what might need to change so that we can maintain as much as possible, like not risk having to throw away the entire product, but rather improve what exists and get it to a place where it does work. And so it's this mindset of, mini investigations, mini experiments, tweaking, and really looking carefully at that data so that we know when those adjustments might need to happen. So behavior change design, I would submit, is a way that we can really create this map, this product vision, and hopefully create a road that brings us from point A to point B so that we can get there. So thank you all. I think we have a few minutes for questions. So I hope you all have some.
All right. Yeah, this is where we get into the fun time right here. And we've got a number of questions that actually rolled through. And how this works, just to remind everybody, once again, you're going to put in your questions and then you're going to vote on them as well and help us out in terms of what we read out. We may not be able to get to every single question. Amy, you did an awesome job, by the way. Appreciate you ending at the time you did too, so because it gives us a little extra time to actually get into some of these questions. So without further ado, the first question that seems to be really popular. So earlier in the talk, you probably mentioned this. How does one, or how do we as UX people, resist organizational pressure to use behavioral change design for dark patterns? And how, so it's really two parts. How do we ensure users can hold onto their own sense of consent?
Yeah, I'm really glad that was asked and that it's a popular question, and it's a hard one. So there's a lot you can do as an individual when you're receiving pressure to use these dark patterns. But actually, one of the things that I did in the book is I interviewed somebody for every chapter who has an expertise in that chapter's topic. And one of the people that I talked to is Cheryl Kababa, formerly of Artifact. And we spent a long time, I can't remember how much actually made it into the interview, talking about this issue. And one of the things that she said that kind of changed the way I think about it is that although we all have an obligation to speak up, to point these things out, to suggest a better way, there are often people who don't have the privilege to leave the room if they're being asked to do something unethical, because there's been this, if you go on Twitter and you look at design ethics discussions, you'll always see people who say, like, why don't you just quit? Why are you working for this organization? And Cheryl pointed out, I think very correctly, that for people who are early in their career or, they don't have a cushion of money to fall back on, you can't just get up and walk out of your job. And so there may be situations where somebody finds themselves working on something they don't feel comfortable with, not feeling like they have a lot of alternative. And I don't want to just say, oh, that's okay, just do the work, because that's not the point here. The point, I guess, is I don't feel like I can sit in harsh judgment of people who do that. I think there's a lot of practical reasons why that might happen. That said, definitely speaking up, pointing things out. Sometimes people don't realize that they are encouraging dark patterns. I've had an experience more than once where somebody has suggested things that are really just designed to get more clicks, get more eyes on a screen without serving any greater purpose. And when it's pointed out to them, they're like, oh, okay. And I like to believe that most people aren't starting out as evil, so that if you point these things out to them and they realize that it's not a good idea, they'll change course. And especially if you can suggest something else, it's always helpful, I think, to come not just with a problem statement, but with a solution suggestion. So pairing it that way, and then looking at previous work that demonstrates how a more ethical approach can be effective. So that's another great benefit of the lit review sometimes, is if you're able to show that, I know this feels like the right way to go, but if you look at the research, it's actually much more effective to do it this other way. That comes up a lot with incentives. So with financial incentives, I've worked for a lot of clients where they do pay people to use their product. It's actually really common in some parts of the industry. And research has pretty consistently shown that when you pay people to do something, they get fixated on the payment as opposed to anything else you're asking them to do. And so you can't stop paying them, because then they'll quit. They expect a raise basically every year. There's all this research that shows that that's just not a great thing to do. So if we can point to that research, that will often help as well. And then appealing to others in your organization who maybe have more power than you do. So I've had that even recently where I felt uncomfortable with something and I've talked to my executive team and enlisted their support. Get the people who do have power behind you. And then what was the second question? It was about user goals.
Yeah, so do we ensure users can hold account on their own sense of, how do you ensure that users can hold account on their own sense of consent?
Yeah, this is another thing. I have a whole chapter on this as well, about trust and how do we build trust with users and maintain that trust, because honestly, once you've lost somebody's trust, it's so much harder to regain it. It's really imperative that we not lose people's trust if we want to maintain them as users and have that relationship over time. And I think there's a lot of pressure to not do these things that build people's trust. But basically, one thing I think is really important, it's a principle from human subjects research and psychology, and I think it belongs in product as well, is informed consent at every step. So being really clear to people about what their experience might be, what their choices are, what their choices aren't as well. So you think of products where they want you to connect to another device or give location sharing permissions, and maybe the thing doesn't work without that. That needs to be made clear to users, as well as the reason why you're asking for it and exactly how you'll use it. And really expressing that in plain language that people understand. There's also an unfortunate tendency to use a lot of legalese and terminology to protect the corporate entity, but it means that the user doesn't really understand what they're agreeing to. And that can lead to situations where they feel betrayed down the road because something happens that they didn't expect or wouldn't have agreed to, but they technically did. And then offering choice points along the way when you can is really important as well. So just if there's options or things are changing, making that clear to the user, involving them in a conversation. And then depending on the type of product that you have, it might make sense to even check in explicitly and say, hey, you've been using this for 3 months. Let's see, have your goals changed? What's going on with you? A lot of my work is in the health area, and health often offers these sorts of opportunities where somebody may be working on a physical activity goal or something. And it makes a lot of sense, 2 months in, 3 months in, to say, all right, what's going on? Like, are your goals any different now, and adjusting their experience accordingly? So that informed consent, though, I think is a really, really important piece that happens upfront in the experience and that maybe we tend to overlook.
Yeah. Let me get a couple more questions in really quick. So do you have any statistics about how successful the bots and apps are getting to people to change their behaviors? which is one part. And do you have stats about how many tries people have to go through to affect permanent behavioral change?
Yeah, so I don't have any stats off the top of my head. The first one, like how effective these things are, there's a lot of different case studies and pieces of research out there that you can look at, and that there's a range of effectiveness. It's some things are very well done and they tend to be very effective. Others are less so. If you're interested in details around that, one company I recommend looking at is Omada Health, OMADA. They have done one of the best jobs on the marketplace, in my opinion, of creating their outcome story. So they do all kinds of different studies on their product, and they publish them, and they make them available both on their website and then, wherever they've been published. So it's a great example to see the types of outcomes that a behavior change product can produce, and also see how different types of research can contribute to telling that overall story. And then, like on the MadPow website, for example, we have a number of case studies that have some statistics, some outcomes for projects that we've done. I will add a huge caveat that isn't just specific to MadPow, but when you're working as a consultant, oftentimes your clients have confidentiality concerns. They don't necessarily want or are able to let you share what you've done widely. So I would say there's a lot missing from our story, like a lot of really cool work I wish I could tell you the stats about, but because of client agreements, I can't. And then in terms of how long it lasts, again, I don't have stats off the top of my head, but one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that relapse is actually part of the change cycle. So we know that relapse is likely to happen with any behavior change, and sometimes even after someone has been doing the new behavior for a really long time. And so a thing to think about when you're designing something is what happens when a person does relapse. They've made the change, they've maintained it, but then they slip back into their old ways for some reason. And when we were talking about trust before, that's one of the reasons why that trust is so important, because someone who graduates from your user experience may need to come back someday. And so you want to make sure that you've created a relationship where they feel comfortable doing that, where they want to do that.